In the Pacific Ocean, 700 miles southwest of the coast of Mexico, there is an atoll that France has owned for nearly a century and has never known what to do with. It has been French territory since 1931. It has an inner lagoon that smells of rotten eggs when the wind shifts direction, from the hydrogen sulfide produced by decades of decomposing organic matter with no outlet to the sea. It has thousands of rats, of a size that the sailors who have anchored there describe with unsettling consistency as wrong. It has hermit crabs that move in waves across the white sand and fill the ground with constant motion. And it has a single volcanic outcrop, 95 feet tall, which is the only point from which a human being can see anything beyond the atoll itself. What it does not have is inhabitants. Not because no one ever tried to put people there, but because what happened on that atoll between 1914 and 1917 was enough to make anyone with full knowledge of the facts prefer never to repeat the experiment. In the archives of the Mexican Navy, what happened there is filed as an emergency evacuation. In the records of the United States Navy, it appears as a routine rescue in Pacific waters. The testimony of the survivors was collected only in fragments, and the most precise details about the final months on the atoll took decades to surface, because the people who lived through them had no way to put into words what they had seen without those words destroying them. What happened on Clipperton Island is not a story about the First World War, although that war is the reason it began. It is not a story about the territorial dispute between Mexico and France, although that dispute existed. It is a story about what happens when every mechanism that limits human behavior disappears at the same time, about the kind of people who endure, and the kind of decisions made by those who have no other option left. And it is a story that both France and Mexico have preferred, historically, to keep in the margins of larger narratives. It is called Clipperton Island, and the story of what happened there between 1914 and 1917 is one of the most documented and most silenced of the 20th century. The Clipperton Atoll sits in the tropical North Pacific, 700 miles southwest of Acapulco and nearly 2,000 miles south of the coast of California. It lies at roughly 10 degrees north latitude in the band of ocean that sailors of earlier centuries called the doldrums, weak winds, dead calms that could last for weeks, water temperatures that never dropped below 80 degrees Fahrenheit in any month of the year. For a sailing vessel in the 1700s, crossing that zone could be more dangerous than the destination itself. It is a ring of coral, almost perfectly circular, about 7.5 miles across. The terrain is completely flat. There are no hills, no rises, no natural shade anywhere except what the palm trees planted by colonists a century ago still provide. The highest point of the atoll, if it can be called that, is Clipperton Rock, a volcanic outcrop on the eastern rim that reaches 95 feet above sea level and is the only place on the entire island from which an observer can see the horizon in every direction. It was where the Mexican authorities installed a lighthouse when they sent their garrison, because it was the only spot on the island with enough elevation for the light to be visible from any reasonable distance at sea. The inner lagoon, which at some point in the geological past was open to the ocean, was sealed off by the atoll's own evolution. When the connection to the sea closed, the water was trapped. With no circulation and no renewal, the brackish water accumulated decades of decomposing organic matter. The result is a lagoon with elevated sulfur levels and anaerobic bacteria that stain the water in shades of green and black, and produce that hydrogen sulfide smell that visiting scientists invariably describe as the first sensory impact of approaching the atoll by boat. The second impact, according to the same visitors, is the density of the hermit crabs, and the third is the size of the rats. The atoll's English name comes from John Clipperton, an English navigator and pirate who operated in the Pacific in the early 1700s. Clipperton attacked ships of the Spanish crown along the Pacific coast of the Americas and used the atoll as a temporary refuge, a place to anchor without being seen, to divide the loot, to repair what the ocean had broken. It was the perfect place for that use. Far enough from the main trade routes to receive no unexpected visitors. Enough room in the lagoon for several ships at once, and so inhospitable that no one in their right mind would choose to live there unless they had a very specific reason. Clipperton died in the Pacific in 1722, possibly of dysentery, without ever finding the fortune he was chasing. The atoll kept his name, and for the next century and a half it remained what it had always been, a cartographic reference point in the Pacific. A spot that navigators noted in their logs as visited, with nothing more to say about it. That changed when the 1800s turned guano into one of the most valuable resources on the planet. Guano, the droppings accumulated over centuries by colonies of seabirds, is extraordinarily rich in nitrogen and phosphorus. In the second half of the 19th century, before synthetic fertilizers existed, it was quite literally the best fertilizer available for intensive agriculture. The great colonial powers combed the Pacific for uninhabited islands with bird colonies. Clipperton was one of them. In 1897, the Pacific Island Company, a British firm dedicated to guano extraction on Pacific Islands, established the first mining operation on the atoll. They brought in workers, basic tools, and the equipment needed to export guano to American and European markets. The business was viable as long as guano prices stayed high and the supply ships kept arriving. Both conditions held. The guano trade also brought the dispute that would decide the atoll's future. France had claimed it since the 1700s on vague cartographic grounds based on exploration voyages that had left no permanent presence. Mexico, whose Pacific coast was the closest to the atoll, considered it part of its natural sphere of influence. Both countries claimed it. Neither had established any real state presence on it. In 1908, the Mexican government decided to make its sovereignty effective. It sent a military garrison to the atoll. In command was Lieutenant Colonel Ram Arnaud Vignon, a Mexican army officer of French descent, who was in his early 20s at the time, posted there at the start of what was supposed to be a promising career. Arnaud arrived at the atoll with his soldiers. In time, his wife, Alicia Rovira Arnaud, joined him with their young children. Other officers and soldiers did the same. They brought their spouses and their families. The guano workers, whose mine was still operating, had families too. At its peak, the Clipperton colony held close to 100 people, soldiers, workers, women, and children. It was not, in material terms, a life anyone would choose for pleasure. The heat was permanent and merciless. There was no fresh water on the atoll. They depended entirely on the barrels that arrived on the supply ships. There was no arable land, no vegetables, no fruit. The diet was ocean protein, whatever the ships brought, and little else. Tropical storms hit the atoll regularly and without warning. There was no permanent doctor. The isolation was total. What the atoll did have was operational stability. As long as the ships came, the garrison could survive. As long as the resupply was regular, life in that inhospitable place was hard but manageable. Arnaud maintained discipline. The ships arrived, the children grew. The soldiers served their tours and waited to be relieved. Then, in the summer of 1914, the First World War began. The alliances of Europe, the cascade of declarations of war, the mobilization of millions of soldiers on the other side of the planet, none of it had any apparent direct relevance to a Mexican garrison on a tropical Pacific atoll. Mexico was not a party to the European conflict. The front lines were 6,000 miles away. There was no obvious reason why a war in Europe should affect the delivery of fresh water and provisions to an island in the Pacific. But the Mexican government of that era was consumed by the Mexican Revolution, which had been burning for 4 years, with no point of stabilization in sight. Governments rose and fell. Armed factions controlled entire regions with no coordination between them. The central administration of the Mexican state operated with the priorities of someone fighting to survive. The garrison of a deserted atoll in the Pacific, more than 600 miles from the nearest coast, was nobody's priority. The last regular supply ship reached Clipperton at the end of 1914. At first, the garrison waited. They rationed everything. They fished more. They hunted the birds that nested on the atoll. They built systems to collect rainwater. Ram Arnaud kept the community organized and distributed resources with precision. For the first few months, the situation was tense but manageable. The ship would come. It always came. It did not come. Over the course of 1915, the scurvy began. Scurvy is a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. It shows itself first as extreme fatigue, then as joint pain, as gums that swell and bleed at the slightest touch. Wounds stop healing. Teeth come loose. In its advanced stages, the body's tissues literally disintegrate from within. In its terminal form, it is a slow agony. And it is completely preventable with access to fresh food, 1 orange, 1 lime, any fruit or green vegetable with vitamin C. On an atoll with no arable land, no fruit, no access to any fresh food at all, with a diet based almost entirely on animal protein and whatever remained in the barrels, it was a trap with no exit. The men began to die. First those already weakened by their prior health, then those who had held out longer, but whose bodies could not endure indefinitely without vitamin C. Lieutenant Colonel Arnaud watched his men die one by one. He watched the disease advance through bodies that the medicine available on the atoll could not stop in any way. He kept trying to signal their position. He kept the lighthouse burning. He kept waiting for a ship to appear on the horizon. In 1916, Arnaud believed he saw that chance. A vessel appeared in the distance, on the horizon. Close enough for Arnaud to make it out, but far enough that there was doubt whether anyone aboard could see the lighthouse signal. Arnaud organized a rescue party, men in a rowboat who would go out into the rough sea to reach the vessel and ask for help. The boat capsized. Ram Arnaud Vignon died in the sea, along with the few soldiers who went with him. By that point, he and those men were the last surviving adult males of the original garrison. With their deaths, the number of adult men on the atoll was reduced to 1. If places like this fascinate you as much as they fascinate me, this channel exists exactly for that. Every week we document one of the most remote, disputed, or forbidden places on Earth with real research and verified facts. The subscribe button is right below so you don't miss the next one. Victoriano Alvarez was the lighthouse keeper of Clipperton. His job was to keep the light on Clipperton Rock running, light it at dusk, put it out at dawn, make sure the machinery stayed operational. It was the only signaling mechanism the atoll had toward the outside world, and Alvarez was the man in charge of maintaining it. During the years when there was military authority on the atoll, Alvarez had performed that role without any particular notoriety. The survivor's later testimony describes him as someone who kept a low profile as long as there was an officer in command, someone who set the rules and enforced them. He was not a significant figure in the garrison's hierarchy. He was the lighthouse keeper. When Arnaud died, that hierarchy disappeared. Alvarez was now the only adult man on the atoll. There were, at that moment, roughly 3 or 4 adult women still alive, and 8 children, most of them the sons and daughters of dead soldiers. Among the women was Alicia Rovira Arnaud, the lieutenant colonel's widow, with her 4 children. The women had survived the scurvy epidemic at a considerably lower mortality rate than the men, something later researchers attribute to a combination of metabolic differences and, possibly, the fact that the women received their rations more regularly while the men prioritized physical labor on lower caloric intake. Victoriano Alvarez had the only adult male body on the atoll. He had access to the weapons left behind by the garrison, and he came to the conclusion that in the absence of any other structure of authority, in the total vacuum of any external mechanism of control or consequence, this granted him rights that the later documents describe with a careful restraint that makes perfectly clear what happened, without detailing what the survivors could not bring themselves to articulate out loud, even decades later. Alvarez proclaimed himself king of the island. What followed lasted approximately 1 year. The accounts that researchers have been able to reconstruct from the survivors' testimony, from the reports of the American Navy that rescued them, and from the statements of the sailors who went ashore at Clipperton, speak of systematic violence, of deaths that the official reports never directly attributed to any specific cause, and of a climate of constant terror in which the women and children lived with no possible mechanism of protection or escape. There was nowhere to go. The atoll was 7.5 miles across. There was no boat. There was no sign of any ship traffic on the horizon. The only source of light and signaling the atoll sent out to the world was the lighthouse, and the only man who could operate the lighthouse was the same man they needed protection from. Alicia Rovira Arnaud was in her 30s. She had 4 children to keep alive. She had survived her husband's death, a year of scurvy that had killed nearly every adult in the community, and months of abandonment under Alvarez's terror. What happened at some point in July of 1917 was the result of a decision made by the women who remained on the atoll, fully aware that if they did not act, the alternative was worse. On the 18th of July, 1917, Victoriano Alvarez was struck down and killed by the women of the atoll. The accounts of who acted first, and with what exactly, vary between the available testimonies. The name of Tirza Randon appears in several sources as the person who struck the first blow. Other accounts point to Alicia Rovira Arnaud as the one who made the decision to act. Most likely, given the context of prolonged terror and the absolute need for coordination against the only armed man on the atoll. It was not an individual decision at all, but the result of what several people resolved to do together when no other option remained. Alvarez died that day. And that same day, not the next day, not a week later, not on any date that anyone on the atoll could possibly have planned, the Yorktown, a gunboat of the United States Navy under the command of Captain H.P. Peril, sighted the Clipperton atoll during a routine Pacific patrol. It was not a rescue mission. The Yorktown did not know there were survivors on the atoll. There was no intelligence report, no alert, no search order. Captain Peril decided to anchor simply because the atoll was there, and because it was standard practice for naval patrols to check any point of land in waters that remote. When the sailors went ashore in a boat, they found 4 adult women and 8 children, survivors of what had been a garrison of nearly 100 people 2.5 years earlier, and the body of a man who had died that very day. The American Navy's reports described the physical condition of the survivors with the economy of language typical of military documents. What they say between the lines is enough. The women and children were taken aboard the Yorktown. They were carried first to Manzanillo and then to Salina Cruz. In Mexico, no one officially asked what had happened during those final months on the atoll. No one demanded an account of the death of the only man they had found on Clipperton. If anyone with the power to ask knew what had happened, they decided that asking further was an exercise whose outcome did not interest them. The women never returned to the atoll. The sovereignty dispute between Mexico and France over Clipperton was formally resolved in 1931, 14 years after these events. The two countries agreed to submit the question to international arbitration. The chosen arbiter was King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, whose neutrality in the matter was enough for both parties to accept him. The ruling went in favor of France. The arbiter's reasoning was that France had formally claimed the atoll before Mexico under the applicable international law, and that the installation of a temporary military garrison did not establish effective sovereignty under the relevant criteria. Since 1931, the atoll has appeared in official French documents as l'île de la Passion, the island of passion. France has done almost nothing with that sovereignty. The atoll has no permanent inhabitants. It has no permanent installations. The French Navy periodically sends a patrol vessel to anchor for a few days and place on record that the atoll is still French. There are occasional scientific expeditions that study the ecology of the sulphurous lagoon and the seabird colonies. There are Mexican fishing boats that work its waters without permission, with some regularity. No one expels them with any particular conviction. What Clipperton is today is a flat, empty ring of coral in the tropical Pacific. The coconut palms planted by the colonists of the early 20th century are still there, or their direct descendants, competing with the native vegetation for whatever space the rats have not taken. The rats arrived on the guano miners' ships at the end of the 1800s and found an environment with no natural predators. They have been multiplying, unchecked, for more than a century. Colonies of masked boobies and magnificent frigate birds nest on the atoll every breeding season and fill the air with noise and motion. Clipperton Rock is still there, all 95 feet of it, and at its base there is no lighthouse anymore. The storms have destroyed and rebuilt the structures of the atoll several times since the light went out in July of 1917. The lagoon still smells of sulfur when the wind shifts direction. Alicia Rivera Anu arrived in Mexico with her 4 children and nothing of what she had brought to the atoll years before. She lived the rest of her life in Mexico. She never spoke publicly, at length and in detail, about the final months on Clipperton. The researchers who tried to reconstruct that period worked from fragments, partial statements from survivors, letters from Yorktown sailors, notations in the naval reports that left just enough space between the lines for anyone reading carefully to understand what had happened, without anyone ever having to say it in so many words. The story of Clipperton was never included in any French or Mexican school curriculum. It was never commemorated. It produced no legal process, no official investigation, no public recognition of what the women who survived had been forced to do so that their children would reach the rescue ship alive. The Mexican Navy filed the case as an emergency evacuation. The American Navy filed it as a routine rescue, and the atoll stayed empty, which was exactly what both countries needed it to be, so that neither would ever have to talk about what had happened on it. Clipperton is a place where the abandonment was total, where the system that was supposed to protect the people it sent there stopped working completely, and where the ones left behind had to resolve, alone, a situation that no one should ever have had to resolve. They did it the only way they could. And when the ship appeared on the horizon that 18th of July, they were the ones still standing. What do you think you would have done in their place? Tell me in the comments. There are places the world forgot to talk about. Every week, we document one of them. If you don't want to miss the next one, subscribe. The button is right below. This is where the world ends.